It was supposed to be a simple property check. A small wooden cabin, deep along an abandoned stretch of the Appalachian Trail, a place no one had lived in for years. The man who used to stay there, a quiet trail keeper named Dennis Wilcox, had passed away weeks earlier. His relatives came to clear the house before selling it. But when they stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was thick, almost sweet, with the smell of decay. Dust hung heavy in the light that filtered through the broken window. The furniture was covered in white sheets, like ghosts frozen mid-motion. And then, in the corner of the room, they found a hatch sealed with rusted chains, leading down into darkness. It took 2 officers to break it open. When the door finally gave way, a wave of cold air rushed up from below, carrying a smell no one could mistake. The smell of something that once lived. Their flashlights trembled as they shone into the basement. Metal glinted in the dark. There was a cage. Inside it, 4 shapes sat huddled together, silent, skeletal, their fingers twisted toward the wall. And on the concrete behind them, written in faded red, were 2 words that made every officer freeze where they stood. Please, someone. No one in that room spoke for a long time, and none of them could yet imagine that this was only the beginning of what the police would later call the Appalachian Trail Keeper case. 8 years before that discovery, in the summer of 2012, 4 college students from North Carolina set out on what was meant to be a simple hiking trip. They were young, full of plans, and eager for one last adventure before graduation. Their names were Kyle Edwards, Brandon Mitchell, Ashley Green, and Melissa Wright. They had been friends since freshman year, bound by a shared love for the outdoors and for documenting their travels. Kyle was the loudest of the group, always the first to crack a joke and the last to turn off the campfire. Brandon was quieter, thoughtful, the one who always carried his camera and recorded every step of their trips. Ashley was gentle and observant. She kept a small diary where she wrote about the birds they saw, the trails they took, and the little fears she never told anyone. Melissa, the youngest, had a soft laugh that lifted the group's spirits whenever the weather turned bad. That June, they chose a section of the Appalachian Trail near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, a rugged, forested stretch known for its beauty and isolation. They packed light, tents, maps, a small first aid kit, and Brandon's old camcorder. According to the photos later found on their phones, the first few days were perfect sunlight breaking through the trees, morning mist over the valleys, long trails lined with ferns and wildflowers. They laughed, they sang, and they filmed everything. In one clip, Kyle waves at the camera and says, "We might never come back," before laughing it off. It was the kind of careless joke people make when danger feels impossible. They called home on the second night. Everything seemed fine. They said they'd be back by the weekend. Then, on the 3rd day, the messages stopped. Search teams later reconstructed their path from park logs and the last coordinates sent from Brandon's phone. The trail led deep into a region of the forest few people ever visit, where the terrain becomes uneven and the signal fades completely. Locals sometimes refer to that section as the Hollow because the wind there never seems to stop. No one knows exactly what made them leave the marked route. Some say they took a wrong turn. Others believe they met someone who offered to guide them further in. Whatever happened, their tracks vanished after that, as if the forest had simply swallowed them whole. When they failed to return home, families reported them missing. Search parties combed through miles of forest for weeks, finding nothing but a torn map and a half-buried water bottle near an old footbridge. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, only silence. For years, the case remained open. And every so often, hikers passing through the area would speak of seeing faint lights at night or hearing voices echoing through the trees, calling for help that would never come. At the time, no one could explain where the 4 had gone. It would take almost a decade and a discovery inside a forgotten basement for anyone to learn the truth. By the 4th day, the weather had changed. The clear skies were gone, replaced by a low ceiling of gray clouds that moved like smoke over the ridges. Rain was in the air, the kind that never really falls, but lingers as mist, soaking through everything. The students pushed forward anyway, determined to reach the next shelter before nightfall. Around noon, they stopped beside a narrow stream to rest. The air was heavy and still, filled with the quiet hum of insects. Ashley rubbed her ankles, tired from the climb, while Melissa unpacked sandwiches. Brandon checked his camera battery. Kyle unfolded the map, trying to trace how far they'd come. That was when they heard it, a slow crunch of footsteps from the trees. They turned and saw a man emerge from the shadows. He looked to be in his mid-50s, sturdy, with gray stubble and calm, unreadable eyes. He wore a flannel shirt, worn boots, and carried a small radio on his belt. The man greeted them politely. He introduced himself as Dennis Wilcox, a trail keeper responsible for maintaining that part of the Appalachian route, fixing signs, clearing debris, and helping hikers when storms rolled in. He spoke softly, with a steady voice that carried a strange authority. He asked about their journey, where they'd come from, how far they planned to go. Kyle answered easily, explaining their route and showing him the map. Dennis nodded and warned them that a thunderstorm was expected that evening. He said it wasn't safe to keep walking and suggested they spend the night at his house, a few miles off the main trail. It had spare rooms, food, and a working landline in case they wanted to call home. The offer seemed reasonable. The sky had darkened, and thunder was already rolling in the distance. Melissa hesitated, but didn't speak. Ashley looked uncertain. Kyle, remembering the ranger's earlier warning about weather changes, decided it was better than being stuck on the trail in the storm. Dennis led them off the main path and onto a smaller one that cut through dense trees. The light faded as the forest grew thicker. Branches brushed their shoulders, and the air grew colder with every step. They walked for nearly an hour, following Dennis through a maze of unmarked ground until the trees opened up to a clearing. There, standing alone in the fading light, was a large wooden house, old but solid, with smoke rising faintly from its chimney. Dennis turned to them with a faint smile and said, "Welcome. You can rest here until morning." None of them could have known, as they crossed that threshold, that they were stepping into the last place they would ever see. That night, the forest grew colder than any of them had expected. The air was damp, filled with the sound of dripping water from the tall pines. Kyle Edwards walked slightly ahead, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. Behind him, Brandon Mitchell trudged along with his pack slung low, mumbling about how they should have set camp earlier. Ashley Green and Melissa Wright followed close together, their voices soft, almost swallowed by the rustling leaves. They had met Dennis Wilcox only a few hours before dusk, an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with a weathered jacket and a gray beard that caught the light of the setting Sunday. He claimed to have been maintaining the trail for years, calling himself the keeper of this path. At first, his presence seemed harmless, even comforting. But as the forest darkened and the sound of cicadas faded into silence, a quiet unease began to settle among them. Dennis had suggested a small clearing by a stream where they could camp for the night. He spoke of it with a peculiar tone, as if the place was both familiar and avoided. Kyle, always curious, agreed without much hesitation. Brandon wasn't so sure. "Feels off," he muttered when Dennis walked ahead to lead them. "Guy like that doesn't just live out here for fun." But Kyle brushed it off, saying that the man was probably just lonely. When they reached the clearing, the first thing they noticed was how strangely untouched it looked. No broken branches, no footprints, no sign of animals, just stillness. The stream nearby barely made a sound, flowing so slowly it looked almost frozen. Melissa set down her backpack and looked around, uneasy. "It's too quiet," she whispered to Ashley, who nodded, staring into the trees. Dennis helped them start a small fire. Though his movements were odd, methodical, almost ritualistic, he never looked directly at any of them for long. His eyes seemed to drift toward the shadows beyond the camp, as if watching something move there. At one point, Kyle noticed him muttering to himself, words too low to understand. When dinner ended, Dennis stood, saying he would check the path before turning in. None of them saw which direction he went. Time passed slowly afterward. The forest was completely still, not even a cricket's chirp. Brandon poked at the fire and said, "He's not coming back, is he?" No one answered. Around midnight, Melissa woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. Slow, deliberate. She nudged Ashley, whispering, "Someone's walking around." They both froze, listening. The footsteps circled once, then stopped right behind the tent. A few seconds later, a soft whistle drifted through the air, the same tune Dennis had hummed earlier. Kyle unzipped his tent and shone his flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. Just mist and the faint outline of the stream. But when he turned back toward the fire, he noticed something strange. Dennis's pack was still lying there, exactly where he had left it. He hadn't taken it with him. And that was when Kyle realized if Dennis was still out there, watching them from the dark, he had never planned to leave. The next morning, fog hung thick over the forest, curling low across the ground like smoke. The fire had burned down to a cold pile of ash. Kyle Edwards was the first to wake, shivering inside his damp sleeping bag. The others stirred slowly. Ashley Green, pale and quiet, Melissa Wright, rubbing her eyes, and Brandon Mitchell, who looked around in irritation. "Where's Dennis?" Brandon asked. His voice broke the silence. Kyle pointed toward the trail. "Didn't come back," he said simply. Dennis Wilcox's pack still sat beside the fire, untouched. Inside they found old maps, a cracked compass, and something else, a small metal key wrapped in cloth. The cloth had stains, brown and stiff. Nobody said the word, but everyone was thinking it. Blood. They packed quickly. None of them wanted to stay in that clearing. The fog seemed heavier now, pressing against their faces as they walked. The trail was narrow, almost invisible in places. After an hour, they stumbled upon something strange, a small wooden structure half buried into the hillside. It looked like an old ranger cabin, its roof sagging under years of moss and rot. A sign hung crooked beside the door, the letters too faded to read. Brandon squinted. "This wasn't on any map," he muttered. The door was locked, but Kyle pulled out the key they had found in Dennis's pack. To their surprise, it fit perfectly. The lock clicked open with a dull metallic echo. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and rust. Dust motes floated in their flashlight beams. The cabin was one room, mostly empty, except for a trap door in the center of the floor. Wooden boards surrounded it, darker than the rest, as if they had been replaced more recently. Ashley stepped closer, whispering, "Why would someone build this out here?" Melissa hesitated at the doorway. "Maybe it's storage or a shelter." Brandon knelt, prying the edge of the trap door with his knife. It came loose with a groan. A staircase led down into darkness. The air that rose up smelled metallic, sharp, like rust and something else old, decay. They argued briefly. Kyle wanted to check it out. Brandon said they should leave it alone. In the end, curiosity won. They descended, one by one, flashlights trembling in their hands. The basement was larger than they expected. The walls were stone, wet to the touch. Chains hung from one side, and on the far wall there were carvings, symbols, and numbers scratched into the rock. At the center of the room sat an old wooden chair, bolted to the floor. Ashley's voice shook. "This isn't storage." Melissa pointed toward the corner. There was a camera, an old camcorder on a tripod, facing the chair. Its battery light blinked once, then went out. Brandon turned to Kyle. "He brought us here," he said, his voice low. "Dennis wanted us to find this." Before Kyle could reply, they heard movement above, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floorboards. Someone was in the cabin. The trapdoor creaked shut, plunging them into near darkness. Melissa gasped, rushing to the stairs, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. From the other side, they heard a sound, the metallic scrape of the key turning. Then silence. Brandon slammed his shoulder into the door again and again, but it didn't move. The air grew stifling. Down below, water dripped from the ceiling, echoing softly. Ashley shone her flashlight toward the wall and froze. There, beside the chains, hung a photograph pinned to the stone. It showed Dennis Wilcox, younger, smiling faintly, standing with 3 people. The faces of the others were burned out, as if erased, deliberately. Beneath the photo, in smudged black ink, were words that sent a chill through all of them. "The forest keeps what it's given." Kyle backed away, heart racing. "He's been doing this for years," he whispered. And above them, faintly, they heard the sound of the trapdoor latch opening again. Someone, or something, was coming down. For the first few hours, they shouted for help until their voices broke against the cold stone walls. The trapdoor above never moved again. Kyle Edwards, sitting near the base of the steps, kept his flashlight aimed upward, half expecting to see Dennis Wilcox's face appear in the gap. It never did. The air in the basement was heavy with moisture and decay. Ashley Green tried to stay calm, tracing the carved markings on the wall with her fingertips. "These aren't random," she murmured. "They're dates." There were dozens of them scratched into the stone in shaky lines. Some faded with age. The oldest went back decades. Melissa Wright sat huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. "He's done this before," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "People came here before us." Brandon Mitchell paced in circles, muttering curses under his breath. Every so often, he'd kick at the wooden chair, as if breaking it could somehow make sense of what they'd found. The metal bolts didn't move. "He's playing with us," Brandon said. "That freak locked us in here to watch us panic." But the most unsettling part was the sound. Every few hours, something moved above them, slow steps, sometimes dragging, sometimes stopping right over the trapdoor. Once, a faint humming drifted down the same tune Dennis had whistled that first night. They took turns sleeping, though none of them truly rested. Their flashlights dimmed as batteries weakened. Time began to blur. Hours slipped into days. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Kyle rationed what was left of their trail mix and protein bars, but by the 3rd day, even that was gone. Ashley tried to stay rational. She studied the walls again, whispering theories about where the carvings might lead. Near one corner, she found what looked like a loose stone. Together, she and Kyle pried it free. Behind it was a narrow hole no bigger than a fist leading into darkness. From within came a faint draft, cool and damp. "It might connect to the outside," Kyle said. His voice carried a flicker of hope. But that night, hope turned to dread. Melissa woke up screaming. Her sleeping bag was wet not with water, but with something thick and dark seeping from the ceiling. When Kyle shined his light up, he saw what looked like rust until the metallic smell hit him. It wasn't rust, it was blood. Moments later, the trapdoor creaked. Brandon grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a rusted pipe, and stood ready. The door opened an inch, then stopped. Through the narrow gap, a voice floated down, calm and deliberate. "You shouldn't have touched the wall," Dennis said. "That wasn't for you." Then the door slammed shut again. Hours passed. Nobody spoke. The air was colder now, the draft from the hole growing stronger. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear a faint scraping sound, as if something was being dragged through the earth. By the 4th day, their flashlights began to die. One by one, the beams faded until only a weak glow remained from Ashley's small backup light. They huddled together, whispering plans that all ended the same way: uncertainty. Finally, Kyle crawled toward the hole in the wall. "If there's any way out," he said, "it's through here." Brandon tried to stop him, but Kyle was already squeezing inside. The narrow passage scraped his shoulders, stone pressing against his ribs. The air grew colder with every inch. Behind him, Melissa whispered his name, her voice barely audible. Then, From somewhere deep ahead, Kyle heard breathing slow, uneven, and close. He froze. A faint light flickered in the darkness ahead, revealing a human figure crouched low, facing the wall. For a second, he thought it might be another trapped person, but then it turned its head. And Kyle saw the face pale, hollow-eyed, and unmistakable. It was Dennis Wilcox. Except, his eyes were completely white. Before Kyle could react, the light went out. In the suffocating dark, his scream echoed through the tunnel, reaching the others like a distant, dying wind. And above, the trapdoor closed again this time, with the sound of a lock turning twice. Despite exhaustive searches in 2012, no trace of the students was ever found. The families returned year after year, putting up posters that faded in the rain and wind. The forest kept it secret, swallowing every clue that might have told them what happened to Kyle Edwards, Brandon Mitchell, Ashley Green, and Melissa Wright. The trail near the cabin grew over with moss and silence, until one day, no one remembered exactly where it had been. It wasn't until 28 years later that the truth began to surface, not by the police, not by a search party, but by accident. Dennis Wilcox had long disappeared from town life. Locals assumed he had moved away or fallen ill somewhere deep in the woods. When he passed away that summer, his niece, a woman named Claire Wilcox, came to clear out his old property. It was a lonely wooden house on the edge of the forest, built long before anyone cared to record its history. While sorting through the dust and mold, Claire found something strange, a hatch in the floor beneath a heavy rug, sealed with rusted bolts. The smell that rose from below was sharp and metallic. She called the local sheriff, and soon officers arrived with lanterns and masks. When they forced the hatch open, a staircase descended into the earth. At the bottom stood a small concrete room. Inside it, a cage, and within that cage, 4 skeletons still bound in rusted chains. The forensic team worked for days, their suits glowing under the harsh light of portable lamps. Dental records confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The remains belonged to the missing students. Each skeleton was found in a different posture, one near the door, as if trying to escape, one sitting upright against the wall, and 2 lying close together, hands intertwined. Among the scattered debris were fragments of notebooks, torn fabric, and a broken camera. The last photograph recovered showed a blurred image of wooden beams, perhaps the ceiling of that same basement, and a shadow that didn't belong to any of them. The house itself became the center of a massive investigation. Old Town records revealed that Dennis Wilcox had once worked as a trail warden during the 1,980 seconds, but after a complaint from a missing hiker's family, he quietly resigned. No charges were ever filed, and he vanished into obscurity. Weeks after the 2020 investigation, when officers returned to dismantle the site, the cabin itself had vanished. Only a shallow hollow and faint boot prints remained. The forest had taken it back, as if erasing what had never meant to be found. Today, locals avoid that part of the woods. They say that on cold autumn nights, you can still hear voices calling from beneath the ground, whispers of 4 students who followed a path that should have never existed. Months after the investigation was quietly closed, the story of Kyle Edwards, Brandon Mitchell, Ashley Green, and Melissa Wright faded from the headlines. The university held a memorial. Professors gave speeches, candles were lit, but none of it brought peace. For those who had searched the forest or seen what lay beneath that cabin, the memory refused to fade. Park Ranger Evan Morris left his job not long after. He told colleagues he couldn't sleep, that he kept hearing things when he tried. Footsteps on gravel, a faint hum in the trees. Sometimes, late at night, he swore he could hear someone whistling just beyond his window. The police files remained sealed, but rumors spread through nearby towns. Campers spoke of seeing a flickering light deep in the woods, always in the same spot where the old ranger cabin once stood. Others claimed to have found pieces of torn fabric, half buried in the dirt, marked with symbols like those scratched into the basement walls. A local journalist who tried to revisit the site vanished 3 days later. His car was found at the same trailhead the students had used, keys still in the ignition. Searchers combed the forest again, but the ground seemed to have changed paths that once led somewhere now twisted endlessly in circles. And then came the most chilling discovery. A wildlife camera placed near the area triggered one night at 2:14 a.m. The footage showed fog drifting through the trees, the faint outline of a man walking slowly toward the lens. He wore an old ranger's uniform, faded and torn. His face was half hidden by shadow, but when he came close enough for the camera to focus, his name tag was visible: Dennis Wilcox. He looked directly into the lens. For several seconds, he didn't move. Then, with a slow tilt of his head, he smiled and raised his hand not in greeting, but in silence, as if warning whoever was watching not to speak. The footage ended there. To this day, no one can explain how a man reported missing over 30 years ago could appear unchanged. But those who still walk that forest know one thing: the woods, remember, they whisper. And sometimes, when the night is cold enough, they hum the same tune that once lured 4 students to their fate, the tune of Dennis Wilcox, the keeper of the path. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Last Seen for more haunting, true mystery stories. Every week, we uncover another disappearance, another unanswered question, stories that the world tried to forget. Your support helps us keep these voices alive. So hit that subscribe button, tap the bell icon, and stay with us, because the next story might be closer than you think. Subscribe to Last Seen, where every vanished story is remembered.